Thank you for downloading this BBC podcast. Analysis is off air at the moment, so we thought you might enjoy this programme, recorded in everyone's favourite abstract pub. Matthew Sweet returns to the Philosophers Arms.
Welcome to the Philosophers Arms, the pub where each week we gather professional philosophers, barroom philosophers, and, well, drunks, frankly, to think through a classic philosophical problem. Nietzsche said that life without music would be a mistake. Wittgenstein was a lovely whistler. Rousseau composed, and later, of course, decomposed. So, with that in mind, tonight we bring music to the Philosophers Arms. Ladies and gentlemen, the Drifters!
Your mama said that through the week you can't go out with me, but when the weekend comes around, she knows where we will be. Ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. Kissing in the back row of the movies on a Saturday night with you, holding hands together, you and I, holding hands together. Oh yeah, smoking in the back row of the movies.
Excuse me. I think we might have to stop you there. Michael, can I have a word with Michael? Now, I know that song was recorded first in 1974. The Drifters were founded in 1953. How old are you?
82.
You can't be. It's impossible. You're younger than I am. How old are you really?
I'm 38 years old.
So, in what sense can you be a drifter then?
Well, I was hired by the Treadwell family, like any other drifter that was a part of the lineup from 1953 to this point. We all had to audition and spend time as understudies with the Drifters and finally get our chance.
So what makes you an authentic drifter then, and not just a very brilliant covers band?
Well, we all have to have the same look, same sound as drifter members of the past. I was likened to a guy by the name of Gerhard Thrasher, who was an original member. I had a similar tenor voice, similar build, and similar look. It's sort of befitting that the Drifters are guys that have come and gone from this particular lineup. As a matter of fact, Clyde McFadden, who actually started the Drifters lineup, spent less than 2 years as a drifter himself. And a lot of drifters in the early days were drafted to the military service, and that's why they left.
Well, listen, I think before we let you play, I think we need to settle this question and decide with this audience here whether we are truly in the presence of the drifters. I'm going to seek the wisdom of the regulars here in the Philosophers' Arms. They say they're the drifters, but are they? Are they not just a perfect tribute act of a band that was founded in 1953, a simulacrum of some sort? Anybody has a thought on that? Bang your glass and we'll come to you. Sir?
To say they're not the same as the Drifters would be to say that the Berlin Symphony Orchestra isn't the same as the Berlin Symphony Orchestra of 80 years ago.
OK. Well, this has happened to a lot of bands, hasn't it? I mean, Bucks Fizz, Hawkwind, the Four Tops, the Sugar Babes, they've all had different lineups. I mean, we don't say the Beatles are not the Beatles because Pete Best was replaced by Ringo Starr. I want to introduce you now to the philosopher Julian Baggini. Julian, what philosophical problem do the Drifters embody?
Well, they embody the problem of many things. What does it mean to say that something is the same thing over time? Because no matter what you look at, virtually everything changes to some extent. And yet, without a concept of sameness, without an idea that certain things can remain the same over time, we kind of are threatened with a kind of logical anarchy.
There's a textbook paradox from which this emerges, though, isn't there?
Well, there is. It actually goes back to Plutarch in the 1st century, but in its philosophical form, it really comes with Thomas Hobbes, and it's the ship of Theseus. And the idea is this: Theseus has this ship, goes into dry docks, and his bits are replaced, and this occurs over time. Like any ship, it needs maintenance. Now, what happens is that over a number of years, actually every single plank, every single mast, every single rivet, or whatever it is they used to make ships in those days, has been changed. So, is it true to say that this is still the original ship of Theseus? Why are people interested in it? It depends on the problem. But I think the problem that is most interesting to people is perhaps when it refers to ourselves, because we're made up of bits as well, and our bits change.
I guess, yes, this paradox may not be too bothersome if we're talking about the replacement of components in a ship, or an axe, the philosopher's axe, or the broom, Trigger's broom from Only Fools and Horses.
Trigger's broom. It comes up against it. If you know the TV series Only Fools and Horses, Trigger got a medal because he is using the same broom from the council. You know, he's a council worker. He used the same broom for 20 years. But he gets his medal. It turns out it's had 17 heads and 14 different handles. That's how many times he's replaced it. So we say, how can this be the same broom for 20 years? To which his answer is he has a picture of him taken with his broom 20 years ago and goes, what more proof do you need?
OK. I want to introduce you now to the neurobiologist Stephen Rose. Steve, what implications does this paradox have for us all?
One of the things that's very clear about living systems is that what gives us identity and continuity and makes us the same person is not molecular identity. Sitting over in the corner over there is my granddaughter, whom I last saw 2 days ago. When she came in earlier on, I recognised her, which should not be surprising. She recognised me, which should not be surprising. But it is actually surprising because every single molecule in her body and every single molecule in my body has been transformed and turned over many hundreds of thousands, many millions of times over that period. So what constitutes her, what constitutes me, and makes us have a sense of identity and continuity isn't the molecular constituents, the original, to use Julian's words. It is the same. It is the same which is provided by structure and what I would call a process identity, an identity that goes through time.
So in molecular terms, we are quite literally not the people we once were.
We're not the people that we once were in molecular terms, although the molecules may be exactly identical copies of the ones that have been turned over before. Every cell in our body decays and is turned over, except for a small proportion of our brain cells. And so we're constantly transforming ourselves.
I believe that your wife, Professor Hilary Rose, is also in the house. Am I right about that?
You are indeed. And I did recognise her when she came. She's sitting over there.
Professor Rose, is this the man you married?
Well, I do recognise him. He's probably the same person that I fancied all those years ago. So, I think that's good.
I'm glad to hear it.
But this isn't how it feels, is it? I mean, surely we all think that there's something within us that remains the same over time, something that's inside us, an essence, a continuity. Bang your glass if you have a thought on that. Yes, let's get the microphone to you.
You were saying about the Beatles before and the brand, the Drifters, but there's an irony there is that one thing about the Beatles is that they changed. So the Beatles that had Twist and Shout were not the same Beatles that had, Long and Winding Road. Whereas the Drifters, what you get is exactly the same thing. If people turn up and they don't get under the boardwalk, they will want their money back.
Julian, can philosophy help us out here?
One of the things that the philosophers have got stuck on is they've wanted to insist on this sharp distinction between what we'd call quantitative identity and qualitative identity. Now, what we mean by quantitative identity is what Stephen was talking about earlier, the substance, the very same substance remaining the same. And then they want to distinguish that between the qualitative identity, which is having the same general characteristics, which you can have even though cells in your body change and so forth. Now, actually, I kind of agree with Stephen here that I think the quantitative identity is fairly irrelevant, actually. What you're interested in, I think, is what are the qualities of anything which need to remain consistent in order for it to be considered the same thing. But you can't get away from the quantitative thing, I'm afraid, because not just any old copy will do. So here we have the authentic Drifters, right? But if we were to have a band that came along doing exactly the same kind of music in the same style, fulfilling all the criteria, but completely independently of that history, you wouldn't say they're authentic Drifters. So it's not good enough that the organisation and the structure and the characteristics are the same. There has to be some story about the things which constitute it.
On my shelf at home, I have an album called The Essential Drifters. Julian, are you suggesting that that's a bit of a misnomer?
Well, I think when you start looking for essences, you're often in trouble, which is interesting because in terms of people, a lot of people do instinctively feel, yes, I have some kind of essence. Do people really feel that they have an essence which is unchanging, something about them which has remained the same since they were young, despite all the changes, despite all the maturity and so forth? Do people feel they have this unchanging essence at their core?
OK, I want to introduce you now to the author and academic Kathy Butler here. Kathy, tell us how your experience interacts with the ideas that we've heard.
Well, one perhaps important thing, or perhaps not, I'm in two minds about it myself, is that I transitioned from male to female. And this obviously does bring up certain questions to do with continuity and change. Most of those questions seem to be more urgent and perhaps even more traumatic for people who aren't me than for me, because I have a great sense of continuity between the before me and the after me, or the now me, if you want to put it that way. I have the same personality, the same memories, the same tastes, the same hobbies. But there are certain people who find that there's too much of a disjunct. And I've had people say to me in quite distressing ways, you are no longer the same person, you have changed. Or even, the person you were before is dead to me. And so to me, this is very shocking.
What makes you, you?
That's quite a big one. I don't feel that I have an essence in quite the sense that Julian was talking about. I do feel that I have what we might call a continuity and a sort of house style, if you like. So a continuous narrative which allows me to connect myself now and myself in the past and recognise it as coming from the same pen.
So there's no discontinuity for you, but what is that continuity composed of, as it were? What does it mean?
Well, it's a continuous narrative which I have from my conscious voice. It is, as I say, a certain style of being, a style of thinking, and a style of experiencing which I can integrate. I teach literature for a living, and as part of that I teach genre. And when I'm teaching genre, I often make use of a story by Thurber called The Macbeth Murder Mystery. And in the Macbeth Murder Mystery, it's about a young woman who goes to a hotel. She loves Agatha Christie, and she's forgotten to bring any books. And she picks up a book in the hotel off the bookshelf, and it's a penguin, so she assumes it's a murder mystery. But it turns out to be Macbeth. Obviously, people normally read Macbeth knowing it's a tragedy, looking for poetic power, looking for characterization and all those things. She reads it looking for clues, for red herrings and for suspects, and to find out who really murdered Duncan. It's obviously not Macbeth, that's too obvious. So she's reading the same words in the same order, but she's reading a very different text. Quite often what people find is that they've been reading me in one genre, and I'm now saying, I need to be read in this other genre.
Julian Baggini, what can philosophy tell us about Kathy's experience?
Well, actually, I think it's more important what Kathy's experience can tell philosophy. What that shows is that our bodies are important to us. They're important to how we feel we are, which is why some people want to change their bodies. But what links us is, I think, as Kathy was saying, it's actually to do with having a kind of narrative, a set of memories. I mean, memory is probably the most important aspect of here, but not just memory, things like personality, dispositions, projects, relationships.
But on what things are those founded? I mean, Kathy talked about a text, people talk about essence, people talk about the soul too, don't they? What is the vehicle for this continuous narrative?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, but in a way it's the wrong question, because people think if you can find the vehicle, you're going to find the self. But no, what you do if you find the vehicle is you find exactly that, the vehicle, the thing which carries us forward. What's important is what it is carrying forward. And that I'm